In the mountains of Colorado, at 7,522 feet above sea level, stands a white hotel that seems to float among the clouds. Colonial Revival architecture. Columns supporting wide balconies. Windows reflecting snow-capped peaks. Since 1909, travelers have climbed the winding road to Estes Park, seeking the Stanley Hotel, drawn by stories of ghosts walking its corridors. Room 217, where the dead play piano at midnight. Room 401, where children's laughter echoes in empty spaces. The fourth floor, where guests refuse to sleep. But the real ghost story began decades earlier, with a sickly child in Maine who couldn't breathe, and a desperate father who would build an empire trying to save him. Freeland Oscar Stanley was born on June 1, 1849 in Kingfield, Maine, a town so small it barely appeared on maps. The sixth of 7 children born to Solomon and Aphia Stanley. The family lived in dignified poverty, the father trying to support 9 people with irregular income from manual labor. Maine winters were brutal. The cold penetrated thin wooden walls. Food was scarce during the long months when snow blocked roads and work disappeared. Freeland, called Fo by everyone, was the weakest of the siblings. Born premature, underweight, struggling for every breath from his first day. Tuberculosis stalked families like an invisible predator in the 19th century. Fo developed symptoms at 7 years old. The persistent cough that wouldn't stop. Night sweats that soaked through bedding. Weight loss that turned a thin child into a skeleton. Doctors offered the same diagnosis they gave thousands: consumption. The disease that consumed its victims from within. There was no cure. Treatment consisted of fresh air, rest, and prayer. Most children with advanced consumption died within 2 years. Fo survived but was left marked. His lungs never fully healed. Any physical exertion left him gasping. Maine winters nearly killed him every year. Solomon Stanley was a carpenter when he could find work, but his true passion was invention. He spent nights in his improvised workshop, surrounded by tools and wood pieces, trying to create things that would make life easier. His children absorbed that mentality. If something didn't exist, you built it. If something was broken, you fixed it. Poverty was no excuse for passivity. It was fuel for creativity. Fo watched his father work despite having no formal education, no capital, no connections. Just hands and brain and stubborn refusal to accept limitations. Fo's education was intermittent. Illness kept him home for months at a time. When he attended the local school, he was the sickly child who coughed constantly, who couldn't play with others, who sat near the stove trembling while his classmates ran outside. Teachers didn't expect much from him. A child that sick wouldn't live to adulthood. Why waste educational resources? But Fo taught himself. He read everything he could find. He studied his father's projects, learning principles of mechanics and design without formal instruction. His mind compensated for what his body couldn't do. At 16, Fo left school permanently. Not because he wanted to, but because his family needed income and his health made formal education impossible. He began working with his brother Francis, who had established a small business making photographic portraits. Photography in the 1860s was complex, requiring chemical knowledge and precise technical skill. Fo discovered he had a talent for it. His hands, weakened by disease, were extraordinarily precise with delicate tools. His mind understood the chemistry involved in the developing process. Within a year, he was a better photographer than his brother. The Stanley brothers established a photographic studio in Lewiston, Maine in 1874. Fo was 25 years old, and his tuberculosis had entered a phase of temporary remission. He still coughed. He still tired easily. But he could work most days. The photographic business provided steady, if modest, income. Families came to have formal portraits taken. Fo perfected techniques to make people look better in photographs. He adjusted lighting, angles, poses. Discovered that small changes in positioning could transform an ordinary face into something memorable. It was craftsmanship as much as science. In 1875, Fo met Flora Tileston at a social function in Lewiston. She was 19 years old, daughter of a respectable middle-class family. She was educated, played piano, read literature. Fo was fascinated, not just by her beauty, but by her intelligence. Flora conversed about ideas, about books, about the world beyond Maine. For a man who had spent his childhood confined by illness, she represented everything he had lost. They married in 1876. Flora knew she was marrying a sick man. Fo was honest about his tuberculosis, about the likelihood he wouldn't live to 40. She married him anyway. The marriage brought emotional stability but didn't cure his lungs. Winters remained torture. Every year, between November and March, FO worsened. He coughed up blood. Lost weight. Flora cared for him with devotion that bordered on obsession. There were cases where wives abandoned tubercular husbands for fear of contagion. Flora stayed. She became his nurse, his business partner, his reason to keep fighting. The photographic business prospered modestly. They opened a second studio. But FO's health remained precarious. Doctors told Flora to prepare for his death. Tuberculosis always won eventually. Francis Stanley, FO's twin brother, was physically different. Robust, healthy, full of energy that FO had never possessed. But their minds worked identically. Both had inherited Solomon's inventive genius. While FO managed the photographic business, Francis experimented with technical improvements. In 1883, Francis invented an atomizer that revolutionized the application of photographic emulsion. The device made the process faster and more consistent. The brothers patented the invention and began manufacturing it. The side business generated unexpected income. Other photographic companies bought Stanley atomizers. The modest success validated what they had always believed. Invention could be profitable. By 1890, FO had survived 2 decades longer than doctors predicted. He was 41 years old. His tuberculosis was chronic but stable. The photographic atomizer business was generating significant income. The Stanley brothers were known in professional photographic circles as innovators. But FO felt restless. Photography had been necessity, not passion. He had spent his life sick, limited, watching the world from the margins. Now, with some financial security, he wanted more. Wanted to create something that mattered. Something that would outlast his damaged lungs. In 1896, everything changed. Francis saw an experimental motorized vehicle at an exhibition in Boston. A crude automobile powered by a gasoline engine. The technology was primitive, expensive, unreliable. Most people considered automobiles a passing fad. Horses were proven transportation. Why invest in noisy, smoking machines that broke down constantly? But Francis saw potential. More importantly, FO saw potential. They began researching automobile technology obsessively. Studied European designs. Analyzed American attempts. Identified what didn't work and why. The Stanley brothers concluded that gasoline engines were the wrong approach. Too complex. Too many moving parts that could fail. Too difficult to start and operate. They believed steam power was superior. Steam engines were proven technology. Railroads used them reliably for decades. If you could miniaturize a steam engine and mount it in a light vehicle, you'd have simple, powerful, reliable transportation. FO threw himself into the project with intensity that worried Flora. He worked 18-hour days despite chronic illness. Drew designs. Built prototypes. Failed repeatedly. Each failure taught them something. In 1897, after months of experiments, the Stanley brothers produced their first functional vehicle. The Stanley Steamer. A lightweight car powered by a compact steam engine. It worked. Not perfectly, but it moved under its own power. Reached speeds of 15 miles per hour. Could climb hills that horses struggled with. The brothers refined the design through 1897 and 1898. Made it lighter, faster, more reliable. By 1899, they had a vehicle they could demonstrate publicly. The Stanley Steamer debuted at automobile shows in 1899 and created a sensation. Most automobiles at the time were unreliable novelties. The Stanley Steamer actually worked. It was faster than competing vehicles. Quieter than gasoline engines. Simpler to operate. Orders came immediately. Wealthy enthusiasts wanted this new machine. The brothers couldn't manufacture fast enough. They sold 200 vehicles in 1899, an enormous number for the infant automobile industry. Each car sold for $600, equivalent to roughly $20,000 today. The Stanley brothers had stumbled into unexpected fortune. In 1899, FO Stanley was 50 years old. He had survived tuberculosis that should have killed him at 10. Built successful businesses through intelligence and persistence. Now suddenly he was becoming wealthy. The photographic atomizer provided steady income. The Stanley Steamer was generating serious money. Automobile manufacturers approached the brothers with purchase offers. In 1899, they sold manufacturing rights to their steam car design for $250,000. Split between the brothers, FO received $125,000. Adjusted for inflation, roughly $4 million. For a man who grew up in poverty in rural Maine, the sum was incomprehensible. The money should have meant security, comfort, the ability to finally rest. Instead, it intensified FO's tuberculosis. The stress of rapid business growth, the long hours, the travel to demonstrate vehicles, had taken a cumulative toll. By 1903, FO was coughing up blood daily. Losing weight again. Doctors delivered the diagnosis he had heard his entire life. His lungs were failing. This time, they said, there would be no remission. He had perhaps 2 years to live. The recommendation was the same as always: fresh air, rest, dry climate. FO was 54 years old. He had built a fortune and was going to die before enjoying it. Flora refused to accept the prognosis. If doctors said dry air might help, they would find the driest air available. She researched obsessively, wrote to doctors across the country asking for recommendations. One physician suggested the American West, specifically Colorado. The high altitude, dry air, and abundant sunshine had reportedly helped tuberculosis patients. It was a desperate gamble, but they had money now. They could afford to chase miracles. In the summer of 1903, FO and Flora Stanley boarded a train westward, leaving Maine behind, searching for air thin enough that FO's damaged lungs might finally heal. The train climbed through mountain passes, higher and higher, until FO felt his ears pop from altitude. They arrived in Denver in late June 1903. The city was growing rapidly, transforming from frontier outpost into modern metropolis. But FO needed something more remote. A doctor in Denver recommended Estes Park, a small settlement 70 miles northwest, high in the Rocky Mountains. It was accessible only by rough wagon road that took an entire day to travel. The altitude there was over 7,500 feet. The air was crystalline. Tuberculosis patients who went there sometimes improved, the doctor said. Sometimes. No guarantees. But sometimes was better than the certain death FO faced in Maine. The journey to Estes Park was agony. The wagon bounced over rocks and ruts. FO coughed continuously. Flora held him as he shook with fever and exhaustion. But when they finally crested the final ridge and saw Estes Park Valley spread below them, something shifted. The vista was overwhelming. Long's Peak dominated the western horizon, rising over 14,000 feet. Meadows stretched between granite cliffs. The air was so clear that distant mountains looked close enough to touch. FO took a breath. It hurt, as breathing always hurt. But the air was different, cold and thin and somehow clean. They rented a cabin from Lord Dunraven, an Irish aristocrat who owned most of the land around Estes Park. The settlement consisted of perhaps 30 permanent residents. A few ranchers. Some prospectors. Tourists were beginning to discover the area, coming for summer months to escape the heat of eastern cities. But in 1903, Estes Park was still frontier. No electricity. No running water. Supplies came by wagon from Loveland, the nearest town with railroad access. It was primitive, isolated, exactly what FO needed. The first weeks were difficult. FO's body had to adjust to altitude. His heart pounded from minimal exertion. He gasped for breath after walking 100 feet. But gradually, impossibly, he began to improve. The constant cough diminished. He stopped coughing up blood. His appetite returned. Flora watched in disbelief as color came back to his face. After 2 months in Estes Park, FO was healthier than he had been in decades. The thin mountain air, which should have made breathing harder, somehow made it easier. His damaged lungs worked better at high altitude than they ever had at sea level. By September 1903, FO was taking long walks through the valley. Not without difficulty, but walking distances that would have been impossible in Maine. He and Flora explored the area, hiking to hidden lakes, climbing to viewpoints where they could see mountain ranges stretching to every horizon. FO felt reborn. After a lifetime of illness, he was experiencing something approaching health. The tuberculosis hadn't disappeared, but it had retreated. As long as he stayed in Colorado's dry mountain air, he could function almost normally. FO and Flora returned to Maine in fall of 1903, but FO's health deteriorated immediately. Within weeks, the cough returned. The night sweats. The weight loss. The pattern was undeniable. Maine's damp climate was killing him. Colorado's dry altitude was keeping him alive. In early 1904, they made the decision. They would move to Colorado permanently. FO would build a house in Estes Park. More than a house. An estate. something grand enough to match his fortune and his gratitude for the miracle of being able to breathe. But when Fo returned to Estes Park in summer of 1904, he saw something that troubled him. The settlement had no proper accommodations for visitors like himself. Wealthy tuberculosis patients were arriving, drawn by reports of the healing air. They rented primitive cabins, slept in conditions barely better than camping. These were people who could afford comfort, but had nowhere to find it. Fo recognized a business opportunity and something more. He could build a hotel. Not a rustic lodge, but a genuine grand hotel. East Coast luxury transported to Colorado mountains. A place where people like him, sick and desperate, could come to heal in style. The idea consumed him through 1904 and 1905. Fo sketched plans, consulted with Flora, whose opinion he valued above anyone else's. A grand hotel at high altitude presented enormous challenges. All building materials would have to be hauled up the mountain wagon road. Supplies, furnishings, everything. There was no electricity in Estes Park, so the hotel would need its own power generation. No running water, so wells would need to be drilled and plumbing systems installed. No telephone service. No easy access to Denver. Building a luxury hotel in such isolation seemed absurd. Fo was undeterred. He had money. He had motivation. He had experienced firsthand how Colorado altitude could transform a life. If he could create a place where other tuberculosis sufferers could come, could breathe, could live instead of just waiting to die, he would build something that mattered. The hotel would be his legacy. More permanent than any business. More meaningful than money in a bank. It would be a monument to the second chance that Estes Park had given him. In 1906, Fo began by purchasing land. He chose a spectacular location, an elevation east of Estes Park Village with unobstructed views toward Long's Peak and the surrounding mountains. 160 acres that would provide privacy and grandeur. He paid $3,000 cash for land that most people considered worthless. Too remote, too high, too difficult to develop. But Fo saw what it could become. A palace in the mountains where the sick could heal and the wealthy could marvel at nature's majesty. Finding an architect proved challenging. Most refused to design a large hotel in such an inaccessible location. Those who would consider it wanted to build a rustic log structure, appropriate for a mountain setting. Fo rejected that approach. He wanted colonial revival architecture. White painted wood. Columns and verandas. Classical proportions. The hotel should look like it belonged in New England, transported intact to Colorado. The contrast between formal Eastern architecture and wild Western landscape was exactly what he envisioned. The design would make a statement. Civilization and refinement could exist anywhere, even at 7,500 feet in the Rocky Mountains. Freeland Oscar Stanley, the man who spent his childhood too weak to attend school, was about to build one of the most ambitious hotels in America in one of the most improbable locations imaginable. And like Woolworth, he had no idea that his palace would bring tragedy along with grandeur. Construction began in summer of 1907. The challenges were immediate and overwhelming. Every board, every nail, every sheet of glass had to be hauled up the wagon road from Loveland. A journey that took 6 hours in good weather became impossible during storms. Supply wagons got stuck in mud, broke axles on rocks, occasionally plunged off the narrow road into canyons below. Workers had to be imported from Denver since Estes Park's tiny population couldn't provide necessary labor. Housing the construction crew required building temporary barracks before work on the hotel could even begin. Fo supervised construction personally, despite his health limitations. He arrived at the site each morning, walked among the crews, inspected every detail. His background in mechanical invention made him particular about how things should be built. He insisted on specific engineering approaches. Demanded quality that workers found excessive for a mountain hotel that few guests would ever see. But Fo was building more than a hotel. He was building the structure that had saved his life. Every beam and every stone represented his gratitude for being able to breathe. The hotel's design reflected Fo's vision of Eastern sophistication imposed on Western wilderness. Colonial revival style with Georgian influences. The main building would be 4 stories tall. 48 guest rooms initially, with room for expansion. A grand lobby. Formal dining room. Music room. Billiard room. Wide verandas wrapping around the building where guests could sit in wicker chairs and breathe the healing mountain air. Every room would have views. Most would look west toward Long's Peak. The architecture would frame the landscape like a painting in a gallery. Modern conveniences were essential to FO's vision. The hotel would have electricity from its own hydroelectric plant, running water from wells drilled deep into mountain bedrock. Central heating using a system FO designed himself. Telephones connecting rooms to the front desk. Elevators carrying guests between floors. These amenities were standard in urban hotels, but nearly impossible at high altitude in remote mountains. FO insisted on all of them. His hotel would not be a primitive retreat. It would be a civilized oasis. Flora Stanley was intimately involved in interior design decisions. She had developed refined taste during years of relative financial success. She ordered furniture from Grand Rapids, Michigan, carpets from New York, crystal chandeliers that had to be individually packed and transported in specially cushioned wagons. She chose wallpaper with floral patterns for the hallways, velvet curtains for the dining room, fine china for the kitchen. Each element was selected to create an atmosphere of discreet luxury. Guests should feel they were in a first-class urban hotel that happened to be located in the mountains. The construction consumed 2 years and over $500,000. Adjusted for inflation, roughly $15 million in modern currency. The cost far exceeded initial estimates. FO didn't care. He had a fortune from the Stanley steamer. Money was a renewable resource. What mattered was creating something perfect. Something that would draw wealthy invalids to Estes Park. Something that would prove that civilization could thrive anywhere human will demanded it. By summer of 1909, the Stanley Hotel was nearly complete. The white-painted exterior gleamed against dark pine forests. The red tile roof was visible for miles. Interior spaces were appointed with furniture and fixtures that would have been appropriate in Boston or New York. Staff had been hired and trained. A chef imported from Denver. Maids taught to maintain the standards of cleanliness that FO and Flora demanded. Groundskeepers who would maintain formal gardens around the building. Everything was ready for the grand opening scheduled for July 1909. FO orchestrated the opening celebration carefully. Invitations went to wealthy families in Denver, to business associates from his automobile ventures, to journalists who could publicize the new hotel. The event was designed to announce that Estes Park had arrived as a legitimate destination. No longer just a summer camp for rugged tourists. Now a place where sophisticated travelers could experience mountain grandeur without sacrificing comfort. The opening reception on July 4th, 1909 was a triumph. Over 200 guests arrived. They marveled at the lobby with its stone fireplace large enough to stand in. Admired the music room, where a grand piano sat waiting for Flora's performances. Walked the verandas, looking west toward Long's Peak, breathing air so clear it seemed surreal. The formal dinner featured multiple courses served on Flora's chosen china. Wine flowed. A small orchestra played. Guests danced in the music room. FO moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, looking exhausted but satisfied. He was 60 years old and had just completed the most ambitious project of his life. The first years were more successful than expected. Guests came from across the country. Wealthy families escaping summer heat. Tuberculosis sufferers seeking the healing air that had saved FO's life. Adventurous tourists who wanted to climb Long's Peak or explore Rocky Mountain wilderness. The hotel achieved 80% occupancy during summer months. FO added a concert hall in 1913. Built cabins on the property for guests who wanted more privacy. Installed one of the first industrial vacuum cleaning systems in any hotel in America. He continued improving and expanding, driven by perfectionism that wouldn't allow him to declare anything finished. Flora became the soul of the hotel. She played piano in the music room each evening, entertaining guests with classical pieces and popular songs. She organized hikes and picnics, arranged lectures and musical evenings. Her warmth and intelligence made guests feel welcome. Many returned year after year specifically because of Flora. She had become the hostess of Estes Park, presiding over social life in the mountains with grace that made the isolation feel like privilege rather than deprivation. But cracks were appearing beneath the surface elegance. The hotel was expensive to operate. The remote location meant supplies cost double what they would in Denver. Staff had to be paid premium wages to work in isolation. The season was short, only June through September. The building sat empty 8 months of the year, generating no revenue but requiring maintenance and security. FO had built his palace assuming that wealthy invalids would fill rooms year-round. They didn't. Most tuberculosis patients couldn't afford Stanley Hotel rates. Those who could preferred sanatoriums with medical staff, not luxury hotels with mountain views. The hotel had cost more to build than FO anticipated and was generating less revenue than projected. By 1912, the Stanley Hotel was losing money. Not catastrophically, but steadily. FO had enough wealth to absorb the losses for years. But the pattern troubled him. He had built the hotel as a legacy, as a monument to the healing power of Colorado air. It was succeeding as an architectural achievement. Guests praised its beauty and sophistication. But as a business venture, it was a failure. The palace couldn't pay for itself. FO's health remained better at altitude than it had ever been at sea level, but tuberculosis was still eroding his lungs. By 1915, he was 76 years old. The energy that had driven him through construction was depleting. Flora worried constantly about his health. She urged him to work less, to let managers handle hotel operations. But FO couldn't stop controlling every detail. The hotel was too personal, too important. Too much his redemption story made physical. World War I disrupted what little profitability the hotel had achieved. Tourism dropped sharply. Wealthy families who had summered in Estes Park now had sons fighting in Europe. The national mood turned serious. Luxury mountain vacations seemed frivolous. The hotel's occupancy fell below 50%. FO had to lay off staff. He closed entire wings to save on heating and cleaning costs. He watched his masterpiece slowly empty. By 1918, FO Stanley was facing the reality that his palace had been a magnificent mistake. He had spent a fortune building a monument in an impossible location. He had created something beautiful that no one needed enough to make it viable. The hotel that was supposed to be his legacy was becoming his financial burden. And the worst part was knowing that he had built it for the right reasons, with pure intentions, trying to give others what Estes Park had given him. The failure hurt precisely because it had meant so much. The 1920s brought brief resurgence. Post-war prosperity created a new generation of wealthy tourists seeking mountain adventures. Estes Park was becoming more accessible. The wagon road had been improved to handle automobiles. Rocky Mountain National Park was established in 1915, drawing visitors who wanted to experience wilderness with some infrastructure. The Stanley Hotel benefited from this increased traffic. Summer occupancy climbed back above 70%. FO hired staff again. Reopened closed wings. For a moment, it seemed the hotel might finally become the success he had envisioned. But FO's health was declining irreversibly. He was in his 70s now. The tuberculosis that mountain air had held at bay for decades was advancing again. He moved more slowly, tired more easily, spent long periods resting in his private rooms while Flora managed hotel operations. By 1924, he was largely bedridden. Flora sat with him, playing piano in their private suite, reading to him, watching her husband slowly disappear. After 50 years of marriage, she knew this ending was inevitable. Tuberculosis always won eventually. Colorado had given them borrowed time. Nearly 2 decades more than doctors predicted. But the debt was coming due. Freeland Oscar Stanley died on October 2, 1940, at his home in Newton, Massachusetts. He was 91 years old. The man who should have died at 10 had outlived almost everyone who knew him as a child. His obituary noted his invention of the Stanley steamer, his photographic innovations, his role in developing Estes Park. The hotel was mentioned but not emphasized. By 1940, it was just one of many mountain resorts. FO's true legacy was the automobile business, not the palace he built in gratitude for air that let him breathe. Flora survived FO by only 3 years. Without him, she lost purpose. The hotel had always been their shared dream. Managing it alone felt empty. She died in 1943, age 87. The Stanleys were buried together in Boston. Their bodies returned east, leaving behind the mountain paradise that had saved FO's life and the white hotel that was supposed to commemorate that miracle. The hotel passed through various ownerships in the 1940s and 1950s. None of the new owners understood what FO had built. They saw only a large, expensive property in a remote location with a short operating season. The grandeur that FO had insisted upon now seemed excessive. The formal elegance felt dated. Tourists in the 1950s wanted rustic mountain lodges, not colonial revival hotels that looked transplanted from New England. Occupancy rates dropped steadily. New owners would purchase the property, attempt various improvements, fail to make it profitable, and sell at a loss. By 1960, the Stanley Hotel was deteriorating visibly. Paint was peeling from the exterior. Roof tiles were missing. Interior furnishings that Flora had chosen so carefully were worn and shabby. The grand piano in the music room was out of tune. The elevators broke down frequently. The plumbing system, always problematic at high altitude, was failing. The hotel needed massive investment to bring it up to modern standards. No owner was willing to make that investment. The building was slowly dying. The 1960s and early 1970s were the darkest period. The hotel operated sporadically, opening only for summer months and closing completely during winters. Staff was minimal. Maintenance was deferred. Parts of the building were closed off because they were too expensive to heat and maintain. The grand hotel that F.O. Stanley built was becoming a ghost of itself. Empty corridors. Dark rooms. Silence where there should have been music and conversation. The palace was haunting itself before any supernatural presence moved in. Local stories about the hotel began to change during this period. Earlier generations had spoken of the Stanley as a symbol of Estes Park's sophistication. Now people told darker stories. Staff reported strange occurrences. Pianos playing in empty rooms. Voices in corridors where nobody walked. Doors opening and closing without explanation. Guests complained about feeling watched, about hearing footsteps in unoccupied spaces above their rooms. The hotel was developing a reputation for being haunted. Whether the hauntings were real or imagined, they reflected the building's transformation. F.O. Stanley had built the hotel as a place of healing and hope. Now it was becoming associated with unease and fear. The empty rooms and deferred maintenance created an atmosphere of abandonment. Old hotels always generate ghost stories. The Stanley's isolation and decaying grandeur made it particularly susceptible. Staff working alone in the massive building after dark heard every creak and groan. Their imaginations filled empty spaces with presences that might or might not exist. By 1974, the Stanley Hotel was on the verge of closure. The current owners were prepared to sell the property for demolition. The land was valuable even if the building wasn't. Developers proposed tearing down the hotel and replacing it with a condominium complex. The local historical society protested, but lacked resources to purchase the property. It seemed inevitable that F.O. Stanley's masterpiece would be destroyed, replaced by modern structures with no connection to the history or the man who had built something beautiful in gratitude for being allowed to live. Then Stephen King arrived. In late September 1974, Stephen King and his wife Tabitha were driving through Colorado on vacation. They had heard about the Stanley Hotel and decided to spend a night there before it closed for the season. The hotel was nearly empty. The Kings were among the last guests before the building would shut down for winter. Staff was already covering furniture and draining pipes. The sense of abandonment was overwhelming. King was already a published novelist, but not yet the household name he would become. Carrie had been published earlier that year to modest success. He was working on ideas for a second novel, but struggling to find the right concept. That night at the Stanley Hotel, walking through empty corridors, eating dinner in a vast dining room where he and Tabitha were the only guests, King felt something click. The isolation, the history, the sense of presences in empty spaces. All of it coalesced into a vision for a novel about a hotel that came alive during winter isolation. A hotel that drove its caretaker insane. King wrote The Shining over the next year. The novel was published in 1977 and became an immediate bestseller. The Overlook Hotel in The Shining was fictional, but King acknowledged that the Stanley Hotel inspired it. The layout of the fictional hotel, the isolated mountain setting, the sense of presences watching from empty rooms. All came from that night in September 1974 when King stayed in a dying hotel that was preparing to close forever. The novel's success changed the Stanley Hotel's fate. Suddenly, people wanted to visit the place that inspired Stephen King. Tourism inquiries increased. The property's owners recognized they had an unexpected asset. Instead of demolishing the hotel, they decided to restore it. Capitalize on the connection to The Shining. Market the Stanley as the hotel that inspired one of the most famous horror novels ever written. The irony was perfect and bitter. F.O. Stanley built the hotel as a temple to healing, a place where the sick could come to breathe and recover. He filled it with beauty and refinement, creating an oasis of civilization in wilderness. Now the hotel's survival depended on being known as the inspiration for a horror story. The Palace of Healing had become a palace of fear. FO's monument to gratitude was being marketed as a haunted house. The transformation would have devastated him. Restoration began in the late 1970s. The work was extensive and expensive. Structural repairs, electrical system replacement, plumbing upgrades, exterior painting, interior refurbishment. The owners tried to restore the hotel's original grandeur while adding modern amenities. They researched what the hotel looked like in FO's era, attempting to recreate Flora's vision for the interiors. The project took years and millions of dollars. The Stanley Hotel reopened in 1983 with a new identity. No longer primarily a mountain resort for wealthy families. Now it was a destination for Stephen King fans and ghost hunters. The fourth floor, which had been most neglected during years of decline and was the source of most ghost stories, became the most requested area. Room 217, where King stayed and which features prominently in The Shining, was booked months in advance. The hotel offered ghost tours, hosted paranormal investigation weekends, embraced the haunting reputation that would have horrified FO Stanley. The transformation of the Stanley Hotel from FO's dream to haunted attraction accelerated through the 1990s and 2000s. Every creaking floorboard became evidence of paranormal activity. Every unexplained noise became a ghost story. Staff members were encouraged to share strange experiences with guests. The hotel's marketing leaned heavily into horror tourism. What FO built as a sanctuary from death became an entertainment complex themed around death. Room 217 developed elaborate mythology. Guests reported seeing apparitions of Flora Stanley playing the piano. Others claimed to smell her perfume. The piano in the music room allegedly played itself at night. Flora, who spent her life creating a welcoming atmosphere, was now said to haunt the building, rearranging guests' belongings and tucking them into bed. The stories were charming rather than frightening, but they reduced Flora to a character in a ghost story rather than remembering her as the woman who made the hotel a home. The fourth floor became the focus of darker legends. Children's voices echoing in empty corridors. Balls bouncing down hallways where no children existed. Rooms where guests felt overwhelming dread. The fourth floor had been servants' quarters in FO's era, cramped rooms where hotel staff lived during summer seasons. Now it was advertised as the most haunted area. Ghost hunting television shows filmed episodes there. Paranormal investigators set up equipment to capture evidence of supernatural activity. The floor that housed workers who maintained FO's vision became a tourist attraction for people seeking thrills. The concert hall, which FO added in 1913, developed its own hauntings. Guests reported seeing an apparition of FO himself standing at the back during performances, watching as if judging whether the entertainment met his standards. Others claimed to hear phantom coughing, supposedly FO's. Tuberculosis manifesting as an auditory haunting. The man who spent his life fighting to breathe was now said to be eternally coughing in the building he created to celebrate breathing. By 2000, the Stanley Hotel had become one of America's most famous haunted locations. It appeared on lists of most haunted hotels, hosted annual events for paranormal enthusiasts, offered ghost tours multiple times daily. The connection to Stephen King's The Shining remained central to marketing, even though the 1980 film adaptation used a completely different location. In 1997, King wrote and produced a miniseries version of The Shining that was filmed partially at the Stanley Hotel, solidifying the connection. The hotel that inspired the Overlook finally got to play itself. The financial model worked. Occupancy rates were strong year-round. The hotel expanded again, adding new wings and renovating existing spaces. By 2010, it had 140 rooms, nearly triple FO's original 48. Room rates were premium. Ghost tour tickets sold out months in advance. The Stanley Hotel was finally profitable 70 years after FO built it. But profitability came from embracing everything FO hadn't intended. He built a place of healing. It succeeded as a place of haunting. Modern paranormal investigators claim to document evidence of supernatural activity. Electronic voice phenomena allegedly capturing spirit voices. Photographs showing orbs and shadows. Temperature fluctuations measured in specific rooms. The evidence was scientifically dubious but commercially valuable. Each ghost hunting show that filmed at the Stanley generated publicity that translated to bookings. The hotel's management understood that the authenticity of hauntings mattered less than perception. As long as guests believed the building was haunted, the business model worked. Staff members had complicated relationships with the ghost stories. Some genuinely believed the hotel was haunted, reporting experiences they couldn't explain rationally. Others were skeptical but played along because hauntings were part of their job description. Housekeepers told guests about seeing apparitions. Front desk staff shared stories about room 217. Maintenance workers described tools mysteriously moving. Whether the experiences were real or performed didn't matter to guests who paid premium rates for a haunted hotel experience. The contemporary Stanley Hotel bears little resemblance to what FO created. Modern additions lack the colonial revival elegance of the original building. Interior spaces have been repeatedly renovated, destroying much of Flora's careful design work. The formal atmosphere has been replaced with casual mountain resort aesthetic. The healing mission has been completely abandoned in favor of entertainment. FO built the hotel because Estes Park saved his life. Now people come because Stephen King's fictional version scared them. Local residents have mixed feelings about the Stanley's transformation. Some appreciate the economic impact. The hotel employs hundreds and draws tourists who support other Estes Park businesses. Others resent that the town's identity has become tied to ghost stories and horror fiction, rather than natural beauty and outdoor recreation. F.O. Stanley helped establish Estes Park as a legitimate mountain destination. Now the town is known for a haunted hotel, overshadowing the wilderness that attracted F.O. in the first place. The National Park Service designated the Stanley Hotel a National Historic Landmark in 1977, recognizing its architectural significance and role in Estes Park's development. The designation protects the original building from demolition or major exterior alterations. Preservationists celebrate this, seeing it as validation of FO's vision. But protection of the physical structure doesn't preserve the original purpose. The landmark designation ensures the building survives while allowing its meaning to be completely transformed. The Stanley Hotel today hosts weddings, conferences, and corporate retreats alongside ghost tours and paranormal investigations. The diversity of uses keeps the property economically viable, but creates an atmosphere of confusion. Brides pose for photos in the grand lobby, while ghost hunters set up electromagnetic field detectors in the music room. Business executives attend seminars in conference rooms rumored to be haunted. The mixing of purposes would have baffled F.O., who built the hotel with a specific vision of a refined mountain retreat for people seeking health and inspiration. Climate change is altering the environment that saved F.O.'s life. Colorado's mountain climate is warming. Summers are hotter and drier. Winters shorter and less severe. The crisp, clean air that helped F.O.'s tuberculosis is compromised by wildfire smoke that now regularly blankets the valley. The physical environment that inspired the hotel's construction is transforming. In another irony, the place F.O. came to breathe is sometimes unbreathable during fire season when smoke obscures the mountain views and guests are advised to stay indoors. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 created an unexpected moment where the Stanley Hotel's history and present collided. The hotel closed for months, empty and silent like it had been during the dark years before Stephen King's visit. Staff who remained reported an increase in paranormal activity, as if the ghosts were reclaiming spaces normally filled with tourists. When the hotel reopened, ghost tours were initially prohibited due to social distancing requirements. A haunted hotel that couldn't offer hauntings had to rediscover other reasons for guests to visit. It was an accidental return to F.O.'s original vision, even if temporary. F.O. Stanley spent the last years of his life watching his hotel struggle financially. He died knowing it wasn't the success he had intended. He couldn't have imagined that the hotel would eventually thrive by becoming the opposite of what he built it to be. The Palace of Healing became a palace of horror. The refuge from death became entertainment based on death. The monument to gratitude became an attraction based on fear. Every choice made in the hotel's restoration and marketing would have struck F.O. as a betrayal of his intentions. But perhaps there's a darker interpretation. Maybe the hotel is haunted, not by F.O. and Flora as the stories claim, but by something more abstract. Haunted by the gap between intention and outcome. Haunted by the impossibility of controlling how your legacy will be understood. Haunted by the tragedy of building something pure and watching it become commercialized. If any structure deserves to be genuinely haunted, it's one where the builder's dreams were so thoroughly inverted. F.O. built the Stanley Hotel to save lives. Now it entertains people with ghost stories. That's a horror more profound than any paranormal investigation will ever capture. The Stanley Hotel in 2025 generates over $15 million in annual revenue, employs more than 300 people year-round, hosts approximately 100,000 overnight guests annually. Thousands more visit for dining, tours, and events without staying overnight. By every financial metric, it's a successful business. F.O. Stanley would be astonished by the scale, but he would be horrified by what his hotel has become. The disconnect between builder's vision and building's reality is central to understanding the Stanley Hotel's legacy. F.O. created something with a specific healing purpose. The structure remains, but the purpose has been completely inverted. This pattern appears throughout American history. Buildings created for noble reasons being repurposed in ways that mock original intentions. But few examples are as stark as the Stanley Hotel. From sanctuary for the sick to entertainment for the curious. From tribute to healing to exploitation of fear. The contemporary ghost tours embody this inversion. Guides lead groups through the building, stopping at locations where paranormal activity has been reported. They tell stories about Flora's ghost rearranging guests' belongings. About children playing on the fourth floor. About F.O. watching from shadows. The tours are entertaining and generate substantial revenue. But they reduce F.O. and Flora to characters. Strip away their complexity, their struggles, their genuine accomplishments. They become props in a ghost story, rather than people who built something remarkable. Room 217 illustrates the problem perfectly. The room is booked months in advance, commanding premium rates. Guests hope to experience paranormal activity. They want to see Flora's ghost or hear unexplained noises. What they rarely learn is that Flora was an accomplished pianist, fluent in multiple languages, a partner in every decision F.O. made about the hotel. She wasn't just a ghost who tidies rooms. She was the person who made the Stanley Hotel worth visiting when it was new. The hauntings have replaced the history with something more marketable, but less true. The hotel's marketing materials carefully balance historical information with ghost stories. They mention F.O.'s tuberculosis and his gratitude to Colorado. They note Flora's role in creating a welcoming atmosphere. But these historical facts serve as setup for supernatural tales. The history exists to give context to hauntings, rather than being valued for itself. It's history as horror movie backstory. The actual complexity of F.O.'s life, the poverty, the chronic illness, the inventions, the business success, the desperation that drove him to Colorado, gets simplified into character development for a ghost story. Stephen King has expressed ambivalence about the Stanley Hotel's transformation. The Shining was inspired by the building, but the novel was really about family dynamics, addiction, and violence. The Overlook Hotel in the book is a malevolent presence that corrupts weak people. King never intended to suggest that the real Stanley Hotel was haunted. But once the connection was established, the hotel's management embraced it without nuance. What was metaphor in fiction became literal in marketing. The Stanley Hotel became the Overlook Hotel in public imagination, despite being fundamentally different. The film adaptations complicated matters further. Stanley Kubrick's 1980 version of The Shining, which King famously disliked, was filmed at Timberline Lodge in Oregon. That building now also claims a connection to The Shining, creating confusion about which hotel inspired what. The 1997 miniseries filmed at the actual Stanley Hotel attempted to correct this, but by then multiple locations were associated with the story. The Stanley Hotel's identity became tangled with fictional versions of itself, layers of reality and imagination impossible to separate. Architectural preservationists praise the Stanley Hotel's survival. So many grand hotels from the early 20th century have been demolished. The Stanley endured through economic challenges that destroyed comparable properties. The building's association with The Shining generated revenue that funded restoration and maintenance. From a preservation perspective, the ghost stories saved the hotel. F.O.'s creation survived by betraying F.O.'s intentions. It's an uncomfortable but pragmatic outcome. This raises a philosophical question about historic preservation. Is maintaining the physical structure sufficient, even if the original purpose is abandoned? The Stanley Hotel's exterior looks much as it did in F.O.'s era. Interior spaces have been restored to approximate the original appearance. But the meaning has been inverted. Does this count as preservation or something else? The building survived. The vision died. Preservationists accept this trade-off. Without the ghost tours and Stephen King connection, the hotel would likely have been demolished decades ago. The choice was between authentic ruin and inauthentic survival. Local Native American tribes have a different perspective on the Stanley Hotel hauntings. The Utes and Arapaho, who originally inhabited the Estes Park area, view the obsession with ghost stories as disrespectful to actual spiritual traditions. The commercialization of supernatural beliefs, the treatment of potential spirits as entertainment, conflicts with indigenous understanding of respect for the dead. The hotel's hauntings exist in a completely different framework from native spiritual practices. But tourists don't distinguish. The result is cultural confusion, where genuine spiritual beliefs get mixed with commercial horror entertainment. Climate change poses an existential threat to FO's legacy, more fundamental than any marketing decision. The mountain environment that saved his life is transforming. Rising temperatures mean shorter winters and longer fire seasons. The crystal air he came for is increasingly compromised by smoke. The diseases that drove him to Colorado, tuberculosis and other respiratory illnesses, would not find the same relief today. The healing that FO experienced might not be possible for a modern patient. The environmental conditions that made the hotel meaningful are disappearing. The Stanley Hotel's future is uncertain despite current success. Ghost tourism trends change. What's popular now might be forgotten in 20 years. The hotel's dependence on the Stephen King connection creates vulnerability. New generations may not care about The Shining the way their parents did. When horror tourism fades, will the Stanley Hotel have other reasons to exist? Can it rediscover some version of FO's original vision? Or has it committed so completely to being a haunted hotel that no alternative identity remains possible? Some staff members try to honor FO's intentions while working within the ghost tourism framework. They research the hotel's history, share information about FO's inventions and his genuine contributions to Estes Park's development. Tell guests about the engineering challenges of building at high altitude. Explain the tuberculosis epidemic and how desperately sick people sought cures. These staff members see themselves as keepers of actual history, working within a commercial structure they can't control. Their efforts are admirable but overwhelmed by ghost story marketing. The COVID-19 pandemic created an unexpected parallel to FO's era. Respiratory illness again became a central concern. People sought clean air and isolation. The Stanley Hotel, empty during pandemic lockdowns, returned briefly to something resembling its original purpose. Not a healing sanctuary, but a refuge from contagion. The silence in empty corridors wasn't supernatural. It was a reminder that buildings outlast the purposes we assign them. The hotel survived the tuberculosis epidemic, Great Depression, World Wars, and pandemic. It will likely survive its current identity as a haunted attraction. F.O. Stanley's actual legacy is more complex than the hotel. His inventions influenced American manufacturing. The Stanley steamer, though eventually superseded by gasoline engines, represented important innovation in transportation technology. His contributions to photography advanced the medium. His development of Estes Park helped establish the conservation movement that led to Rocky Mountain National Park. The hotel is his most visible legacy, but not necessarily his most important. Yet it's what people remember. The inventor, the entrepreneur, the man who survived impossible illness, all reduced to owner of a haunted hotel. Flora Stanley deserves a better memory than hotel ghost who tidies rooms. She was an accomplished musician and intellectual. She managed the hotel's operations during its most successful years. She created the social atmosphere that made the Stanley Hotel a destination rather than just accommodation. After F.O.'s death, she maintained his vision as long as she could. Her ghost, if it exists, probably resents being cast as a supernatural housekeeper. She was so much more than that. The Stanley family's other descendants have no involvement with the hotel. F.O. and Flora had no children. The hotel passed out of family ownership within years of Flora's death. Later generations of Stanleys, descendants of F.O.'s siblings, built different legacies. Some remained in manufacturing. Others pursued different careers. The Stanley Hotel is a historical footnote to them, interesting but not defining. They don't answer for what the hotel has become. That belongs to subsequent owners and managers who made decisions F.O. never imagined. Contemporary guests at the Stanley Hotel have wildly different experiences. Some come explicitly for ghost tours and paranormal investigation. They want to be scared, want to believe they've encountered the supernatural. Others come despite the hauntings, attracted by the mountain's setting and historical architecture. They tolerate ghost stories as quirky marketing. Still others come unaware of the supernatural reputation, discovering it only after arrival. The hotel serves all these audiences simultaneously, creating an atmosphere of confused purposes that would have disturbed FO's sense of proper order. The question persists, is the hotel actually haunted? Scientific investigation finds no evidence. Electromagnetic field fluctuations, temperature changes, mysterious sounds, all have prosaic explanations related to an old building with quirky construction in an extreme climate. But absence of evidence doesn't settle the question for believers. Subjective experiences can't be disproven. People who feel presences, hear voices, see apparitions, they know what they experienced. Whether those experiences have a supernatural source or psychological explanation doesn't change their reality. Perhaps the real haunting isn't supernatural at all. Perhaps the Stanley Hotel is haunted by the gap between intention and outcome. Haunted by FO's ghost in a metaphorical sense. The presence of his vision, forever disappointed by what his creation became. Haunted by the tuberculosis patients who came seeking healing and sometimes died instead. Haunted by Flora's music, still echoing in rooms where tourists now search for ghosts. Haunted by the impossible task of being multiple things simultaneously. Historical landmark, commercial property, architectural achievement, ghost story, wedding venue, conference center. The Stanley Hotel represents a peculiarly American pattern. We build monuments to specific purposes, then abandon those purposes when they're no longer profitable. We preserve buildings but not meanings. We celebrate innovation while forgetting innovators. We turn complexity into entertainment. F.O. Stanley built something remarkable, driven by gratitude for being allowed to live. We remember the building. We forgot the gratitude. We replaced healing with horror. And we call this preservation. The hotel stands white against dark pines, exactly as F.O. designed it. Long's Peak rises behind it, unchanged since F.O. first saw it and felt his lungs begin to heal. The view that saved his life remains. But the building he constructed to share that salvation has become something else entirely. It succeeded by becoming the opposite of what he intended. That's not triumph. That's tragedy with a profitable business model. F.O. Stanley wanted to build a palace where the sick could breathe. We turned it into a haunted house where tourists hold their breath, waiting for ghosts that probably aren't there. The inversion is complete. The haunting, if it exists, is well-deserved. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.